There are moments etched into the soul of the American frontier that define what it truly means to stand against injustice. Moments when a single act of courage draws a line between civilization and cruelty, between humanity and barbarism, between those who watch suffering and those who stop it. In the wild heart of the Old West, where laws were fragile suggestions and where might often made right, where vulnerable people could disappear into suffering with no one to speak for them or defend them, one scene of unthinkable brutality would be interrupted by a stranger whose simple declaration would echo through history as a testament to what it means to be truly human. Picture a young woman tied to a fence post under the merciless sun, her wrists bound with rope that cut into her flesh, her lips cracked and bleeding from thirst, her body showing the marks of beatings and starvation, left there to suffer and possibly die by the very people who should have protected her, the family she had married into, the in-laws who saw her as property to be used and discarded rather than as a human being deserving of dignity and compassion. Picture the cruel faces watching her suffering, laughing at her pleas for water, justifying their actions with twisted logic about discipline and obedience, and a woman knowing her place. Now picture a lone rancher riding past this homestead, seeing this horror unfolding, and making a choice in that instant that would save one life and change countless others. A choice to intervene when doing nothing would have been easier and safer. Speaking 4 words that carried the weight of absolute conviction and unshakable moral clarity. She comes with me. 4 words that would become legendary in that territory as an example of courage standing against cruelty, of strength used not to dominate but to protect, of one person deciding that some things cannot be tolerated or ignored no matter the cost or consequence, proving that heroes are not born, but made in moments when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things, simply because they cannot bear to walk away from suffering when they have the power to stop it. The year was 1879, and the territory of Kansas stretched across the plains in endless waves of grass that moved like an ocean under winds that never ceased their blowing. This was land claimed from native peoples through violence and treaty, land promised to settlers as paradise, but delivering hardship that broke as many families as it enriched. The small settlement of Redemption Valley sat at the crossing of 2 trails, a cluster of perhaps 40 buildings housing maybe 200 souls who had come west seeking opportunity or escape, or simply because they had nowhere else left to go. Life here was measured by survival, by whether crops grew or failed, by whether livestock lived or died, by whether families held together or fell apart under the grinding pressure of daily existence that demanded everything and promised nothing. Among the families trying to make lives in this harsh country were the Hutchins clan, led by Cyrus Hutchins, a man of 50 years who had brought his wife Martha and their 4 adult sons from Missouri after losing their farm to debt and desperation. The Hutchins family had claimed land about 5 miles from Redemption Valley and had built a homestead of rough buildings that spoke of hard times and harder hearts. Cyrus ruled his family with iron control, believing that authority came from fear and that respect meant absolute obedience, teaching his sons that mercy was weakness and kindness was foolishness. Martha, his wife, had long since learned to keep her mouth shut and her eyes down, surviving by becoming invisible, by never questioning or challenging, by accepting whatever her husband decreed as law. The 4 Hutchins sons had grown up in this atmosphere of cruelty disguised as discipline, learning from their father that power over others was to be seized and exercised without mercy. The eldest, Henry, was 28 and had inherited his father's mean streak along with his size and strength. The second son, Thomas, was 26 and quieter than his brother, but no less cruel when given opportunity to exercise power over someone weaker. The third son, Robert, was 24 and married, though his marriage was not a partnership, but rather ownership of a young woman he had claimed as property. The youngest, Samuel, was 22 and followed his brothers in everything, lacking the imagination to question whether the way they treated others might be wrong. Robert's wife was named Clara Mee, though the Hutchins family rarely used her name, preferring to call her Girl or the wife, as if personal identity was something she had surrendered when she married into the family. Clara was 19 years old, small and slender with dark hair and eyes that had once held brightness, but now showed only fear and resignation. She had married Robert 2 years earlier, an arrangement made between her father and Cyrus Hutchins to settle a debt, a transaction in which Clara had no voice and no choice. Her father, desperate and dying, had promised her to the Hutchins family in exchange for money needed for medicine, and Clara had gone to her wedding like a prisoner going to execution, knowing her fate but powerless to change it. The 2 years of Clara's marriage had been a descent into nightmare that grew worse with each passing month. Robert treated her as unpaid labor, demanding she do all cooking and cleaning and washing for the entire family, while he and his brothers did ranch work. But more than the work, it was the cruelty that wore Clara down, the casual violence when she moved too slowly or made some small mistake. The beatings administered not in anger but with cold calculation meant to teach her place and keep her submissive. Cyrus encouraged his sons to be harsh with Clara, telling them that women needed firm handling, that mercy made them lazy and disobedient, that a man showed strength by dominating his wife absolutely. Martha watched Clara's suffering with the blank eyes of someone who had learned that survival meant accepting horror without protest. The particular horror that would bring Clara's suffering to the attention of a stranger who would change her fate began on a morning in late summer when the heat was already oppressive before the sun had fully risen. Clara had been sick during the night, some stomach ailment that had left her weak and shaking, but she had risen before dawn as required to prepare breakfast for the family. She worked as quickly as her trembling hands would allow, but her illness slowed her movements, and she fell behind the schedule the family demanded. When she placed breakfast on the table several minutes later than usual, Robert slapped her across the face hard enough to knock her against the wall, demanding to know why she was being lazy and useless. Clara tried to explain that she had been sick, but explanations were not welcome in the Hutchins household, where any justification for imperfection was seen as an excuse that deserved punishment rather than understanding. Cyrus declared that Clara needed to be taught a lesson about responsibility and duty, that clearly she had been allowed too much freedom and had forgotten her place. What happened next was so cruel that it defied human decency, yet it was carried out with the casual certainty of people who believed they had absolute right to treat another person however they chose. The Hutchins men, all 5 of them, dragged Clara outside into the yard despite her pleas and her tears and her promises to do better. They tied her wrists together with rough rope and bound her to a fence post in the full sun, pulling the ropes tight enough that she could not sit or even shift her weight to ease the strain on her arms and shoulders. Cyrus announced that Clara would stay tied there for the day as punishment for her laziness, that she would receive no food or water, that this would teach her to remember her duties no matter how she felt. Clara begged them to reconsider, explaining that she was genuinely sick and not simply being lazy, promising that she would work harder if they would just let her down. Her pleas were met with laughter from the brothers and stony silence from Cyrus, who seemed to take satisfaction in her desperation. Martha watched from the doorway of the house, her face expressionless, having learned long ago that intervening would only result in her receiving similar treatment. The men went about their daily work, leaving Clara tied to the fence, occasionally walking past her to make mocking comments about her weakness or to refuse her whispered requests for water. The sun climbed higher and the temperature rose into the 90s, and Clara's suffering increased with each passing hour. The ropes cut into her wrists as her weight pulled against them. Her arms ached and then went numb from being held in an unnatural position. Her throat became desperately dry. Her lips cracked and bled. Her skin burned from exposure to the sun. She had stopped crying after the first hour because she had no moisture left for tears, had stopped begging after the second hour because no one would listen. She simply hung there in her bonds, enduring torment that seemed designed not just to punish, but to break something fundamental in her spirit. The Hutchins men ate their lunch in the shade while Clara hung in the sun, drinking cool water where she could see them, making a show of their comfort while she suffered. In the early afternoon, a neighbor rode up to conduct some business with Cyrus about sharing a bull for breeding, and this neighbor saw Clara tied to the fence and asked what was happening. Cyrus explained matter-of-factly that his daughter-in-law had been disobedient and was being disciplined, speaking as if this were the most natural thing in the world. The neighbor, uncomfortable but unwilling to interfere in another man's family matters, completed his business quickly and rode away, leaving Clara to her fate because frontier culture strongly discouraged outsiders from involving themselves in domestic situations, even when those situations involved obvious cruelty. Late that afternoon, as shadows were beginning to lengthen but the heat remained oppressive, a lone rider appeared on the trail that passed by the Hutchins homestead. The rider was a rancher named Daniel James Walker, known throughout the territory as Dan Walker, who owned a successful cattle operation about 15 miles from Redemption Valley, and who was returning home after conducting business in town. Dan was 42 years old, a man who had built his ranch through hard work and fair dealing, respected by those who knew him as someone whose word could be trusted, and whose sense of right and wrong was uncomplicated by the moral flexibility that many frontier men adopted to survive in harsh conditions. As Dan rode past the Hutchins place, his eye caught movement at the fence, and he turned his head to see what it was. What he saw made him pull his horse to an immediate stop, his mind struggling to comprehend the scene before him. A young woman was tied to a fence post, her body sagging in her bonds, her head hanging forward, her dress soaked with sweat, the ground beneath her stained dark where her blood had dripped from her torn wrists. For a moment, Dan thought she might be dead, but then he saw slight movement as she breathed, shallow breaths that suggested someone at the edge of consciousness. Dan sat on his horse staring at this sight, feeling rage build in his chest like nothing he had felt in years. Rage at the cruelty that humans could inflict on each other. Rage at a world where such things could happen. Rage at himself for even hesitating when he should have been moving immediately to help. He dismounted and walked quickly toward Clara, calling out to ask who had done this and where they were. His voice, loud and demanding, brought the Hutchins men out of the house, with Cyrus in the lead and his 4 sons behind him, all of them ready to defend their property from what they assumed was interference or criticism. Dan reached Clara and immediately began working to untie the ropes that bound her, his hands moving with urgent care, trying to free her without causing additional pain to her torn wrists. Cyrus called out sharply, demanding to know what Dan thought he was doing, asserting that this was his property and his family and none of Dan's business. Dan did not stop working on the ropes but called back that he was taking this woman down from this fence and that anyone who tried to stop him would regret it. The calm certainty in his voice, backed by the reputation everyone knew he carried and the gun visible on his hip, made the Hutchins men hesitate rather than rushing forward to confront him. When Dan finally freed Clara from the ropes, she collapsed immediately, unable to support her own weight after hours of hanging in her bonds. Dan caught her before she hit the ground, lifting her carefully in his arms, feeling how light she was, how her body trembled with exhaustion and pain and dehydration. He carried her toward his horse while Cyrus followed, shouting that Dan had no right to interfere, that Clara was Robert's wife and subject to her husband's discipline, that frontier law gave a man absolute authority over his household, and no outsider had any say in how he ran his family. Dan turned to face Cyrus, still holding Clara in his arms, his face showing contempt for what he had just heard. He told Cyrus in a voice that carried across the yard that there was no law anywhere that gave anyone the right to tie another human being to a fence and leave them to suffer in the sun, that what he had just witnessed was not discipline but torture, that any man who would do such a thing or allow such a thing was no man at all but a coward and a monster. Cyrus, unaccustomed to being challenged or criticized, stepped forward with his fists clenched, asserting that Clara belonged to his family through marriage, and that Dan had no authority to take her anywhere. Dan looked at Cyrus with cold eyes and spoke 4 words that would become legendary in that territory. 4 words that drew a line in the dirt and dared anyone to cross it. He said simply and with absolute finality, "She comes with me." The way he said it left no room for argument or negotiation, carried such complete conviction that it stopped Cyrus mid-step. Dan told the Hutchins family that he was taking Clara to the doctor in Redemption Valley, and then to his ranch where she would stay until she recovered, and that if any of them tried to follow him or tried to reclaim her, they would answer to him personally, and they would not like the outcome of that confrontation. Robert, Clara's husband, started to protest that Clara was his legal wife, and that Dan had no right to take her. But Dan cut him off sharply, saying that any man who would treat his wife the way Robert had treated Clara had forfeited any claim to her, that marriage did not mean ownership, that being someone's husband did not give license to torture and abuse. The Hutchins men stood in an uncertain group, wanting to challenge Dan, but recognizing something in his bearing and his reputation that made such a challenge dangerous, weighing their pride against their survival instincts, and ultimately deciding that letting him take Clara was less risky than fighting a man who was known to be both skilled with weapons and absolutely serious about his commitments. Dan carried Clara to his horse and mounted carefully with her still in his arms, settling her against his chest where she could rest while he rode. Clara was barely conscious, her body shutting down from dehydration and exhaustion, but she was dimly aware that someone had freed her, that she was no longer tied to that fence, that somehow her situation had changed though she could not fully process how or why. Dan spoke to her quietly as he turned his horse away from the Hutchins homestead, telling her she was safe now, that he was taking her to get help, that no one was going to hurt her anymore. The ride to Redemption Valley took about an hour at the careful pace Dan maintained to avoid jostling Clara too much, and during that ride, he supported her weight and talked to her occasionally to keep her from slipping completely into unconsciousness. He told her his name and where he was taking her, told her that the doctor would fix her up, told her that she did not have to go back to the Hutchins family if she did not want to, that he would make sure she had choices and protection. Clara heard these words as if from a great distance, unable to respond, but absorbing them somewhere deep in her awareness, hardly daring to believe that escape from her nightmare might actually be possible. When they reached Redemption Valley, Dan rode directly to the office of Dr. Samuel Harrison, the town's only physician, and carried Clara inside, calling for the doctor urgently. Dr. Harrison, a man in his 60s who had seen considerable suffering in his years on the frontier, took one look at Clara's condition and immediately cleared his examination table, directing Dan to lay her down there. He began his examination while asking Dan what had happened, and as Dan explained what he had found at the Hutchins place, the doctor's face grew dark with anger and disgust. Dr. Harrison treated Clara's immediate injuries, cleaning and bandaging her torn wrists, giving her water slowly in small sips because drinking too much too fast after severe dehydration could cause additional problems, checking her for other injuries and finding evidence of old bruises and healed fractures that told a story of ongoing abuse, extending well beyond what had happened that day. He told Dan that Clara was severely dehydrated and malnourished, that she would need rest and proper food and medical care for at least a week before she would be strong enough to even consider what should happen next. Dan told the doctor to provide whatever care Clara needed, and that he would pay all expenses, and he asked if Clara could stay at the doctor's house during her recovery, knowing that the doctor's wife was a kind woman who could provide appropriate care. Dr. Harrison agreed to this arrangement, and his wife Esther, summoned from their adjacent house, came and looked at Clara with tears of sympathy and outrage, appalled that such cruelty could happen in their community. She promised Dan that she would care for Clara as if she were her own daughter, that the girl would want for nothing while she recovered. Dan thanked them both and told them he would check back the next day to see how Clara was doing, and then he went to the sheriff's office to report what he had witnessed, though he knew from experience that frontier law was often reluctant to intervene in family matters, and that getting justice for Clara might prove difficult or impossible. Sheriff Thomas Brennan listened to Dan's account with a troubled expression, acknowledging that what Dan described sounded terrible but pointing out that legally, a husband had considerable authority over his wife, and that proving criminal abuse rather than legitimate discipline was extremely difficult unless the victim was willing to testify and press charges. Dan argued that leaving someone tied to a fence in the sun should be criminal regardless of the relationship between the parties, but the sheriff explained that many judges would see this as a domestic matter outside the jurisdiction of criminal law. He promised to investigate and to speak with the Hutchins family, but Dan left the sheriff's office with the clear understanding that legal remedies were unlikely to provide real justice or protection for Clara. Over the following week, Clara slowly recovered her physical strength under Esther Harrison's care, eating small frequent meals that her damaged system could handle, drinking plenty of water, sleeping for hours at a time as her body tried to heal from months of deprivation and abuse. Her wrists healed gradually, the cuts closing and scabbing over, though they would leave permanent scars. Her sunburn faded from angry red to brown and then to normal color. Her body began to regain some of the weight that starvation had stripped away. But physical healing was only part of Clara's recovery, and the less visible wounds, the psychological damage from prolonged abuse and cruelty, would take much longer to address. Dan visited every day, sitting with Clara for brief periods, speaking to her gently, asking nothing from her but making sure she knew that she had options, and that he would help her figure out what to do next. Clara was initially withdrawn and fearful, flinching when anyone moved suddenly near her, struggling to meet Dan's eyes, clearly expecting punishment or demands or cruelty, because that had been her experience of interaction with men. But Dan's consistent kindness and his obvious lack of any agenda beyond helping her slowly began to penetrate Clara's defenses, and she started to speak with him, at first in monosyllables, and then in longer sentences, gradually revealing the full horror of her 2 years with the Hutchins family. She told Dan about the beatings and the starvation and the constant atmosphere of fear, about how the entire family had participated in her abuse, or at least had watched without protest, about how she had been worked like an animal while being treated as less than human. She told him about the day tied to the fence, and how she had believed she was going to die there, how she had actually hoped for death because it would mean an end to suffering. She told him that she had no family left to return to, that her father had died shortly after her marriage and her mother had passed years before, that she had nowhere to go and no resources to support herself. Dan listened to all of this with growing anger at the Hutchins family and growing determination to ensure Clara would not have to return to them. He consulted with a lawyer in Redemption Valley about Clara's legal options, learning that while she was technically married to Robert Hutchins, she could seek divorce on grounds of cruelty and abandonment, though such divorces were difficult to obtain and often socially stigmatized. The lawyer suggested that the stronger approach might be for Clara to simply refuse to return to the Hutchins homestead and to establish herself elsewhere, essentially daring the family to try to force her return, because community opinion was already turning against the Hutchins family as word spread about what Dan had witnessed. After discussions with Clara about what she wanted, Dan made a proposal. He told her that he owned a large ranch that employed several people, that his housekeeper had recently retired and moved to be with family, and that he needed someone to manage his household. He offered Clara the position, with private quarters in his ranch house, wages, and most importantly, his protection against anyone who might try to harm her or force her back to the Hutchins family. He made clear this was a straightforward employment offer, that he expected nothing from her beyond household management, that she would have complete independence and safety. Clara, who had learned to distrust offers that seemed too good to be true, asked Dan directly why he was doing this, why a stranger would go to such lengths to help someone he did not know. Dan was quiet for a long moment before answering, and when he spoke, his voice carried old pain. He told Clara that he had grown up watching his own mother suffer abuse from his father, watching helplessly as a child, while his mother was beaten and degraded, powerless to protect her. He told Clara that his mother had eventually died from injuries his father inflicted, and that Dan had left home shortly after, unable to remain under his father's roof. He told Clara that he had vowed as a young man that if he ever had the power to stop someone else's suffering, he would do so without hesitation, that saving her was partly about her, but also about honoring his mother's memory by doing what no one had done for her. Clara, moved by Dan's honesty and recognizing the genuine pain behind his offer, accepted the position, agreeing to go to his ranch when Dr. Harrison cleared her for travel. She felt a mixture of hope and fear, hope that perhaps she might actually escape her nightmare and build some kind of life, fear that somehow the Hutchins family would find a way to drag her back, or that this new situation would prove to have its own hidden dangers. 2 weeks after Dan had found Clara tied to that fence, Dr. Harrison declared her well enough to leave his care, and Dan arrived with his wagon to transport her to his ranch. Clara said goodbye to Dr. Harrison and Esther with genuine gratitude for their kindness, and she climbed into the wagon beside Dan for the 15-mile journey to her new home. As they rode across the Kansas plains, Dan pointed out features of the landscape and explained the layout of his ranch, giving Clara information about what her life would look like in this new place. Dan's ranch was considerably more prosperous than the Hutchins homestead, with good buildings and well-maintained fences and cattle grazing across extensive grassland. The ranch house itself was a solid 2-story structure with multiple rooms, built to last and maintained with obvious care. Dan showed Clara to the housekeeper's quarters, a private room on the first floor with a real bed and a dresser, and a window that looked out over the prairie. He explained the household routines and what her responsibilities would include, making clear that she should work at whatever pace felt comfortable, and that he was not expecting perfection, but simply honest effort. The first weeks of Clara's new life were a period of adjustment and healing, both physical and emotional. She threw herself into her work, cleaning and cooking and managing household tasks with determination born partly from gratitude and partly from deep fear that if she did not prove her value, she would be sent back to the Hutchins family. But Dan noticed her anxiety and spoke to her about it directly, telling her that her position was secure regardless of occasional mistakes, that he valued her well-being more than perfect housekeeping, that she needed to understand she was safe and not performing for her survival. Dan's ranch employed several cowboys who worked the cattle and maintained the property, and he made absolutely clear to all of them that Clara was under his protection, that she was to be treated with complete respect, and that any man who made her uncomfortable or spoke to her inappropriately would be fired immediately and personally escorted off the property. The men, who respected Dan and did not want to lose good employment, treated Clara with careful courtesy, tipping their hats when they saw her and speaking politely but maintaining appropriate distance. As months passed, Clara began to relax into her new life, to believe that perhaps she really was safe, that Dan's protection was genuine and not temporary. She began to smile occasionally, to show glimmers of personality that had been crushed during her marriage, to take interest in things beyond mere survival. Dan noticed these changes and felt satisfaction at seeing Clara gradually emerge from the shell of fear and depression that had encased her when he first found her. The relationship between Dan and Clara remained strictly professional during this period, with clear boundaries maintained by both parties. Dan was careful never to make Clara uncomfortable, or to give any indication that he expected anything beyond the household management they had agreed upon. But as they shared meals and occasional conversations, a mutual respect began to develop, a recognition that they were both people who had suffered in their pasts and who understood the value of safety and dignity. The threat of the Hutchins family remained in the background of Clara's awareness during this time. Robert Hutchins had made several attempts to contact her, sending messages through townspeople demanding that she return to him, asserting his rights as her husband, threatening legal action to force her compliance. Dan had intercepted these messages and had replied on Clara's behalf, making absolutely clear that Clara was not returning, that any attempt to take her by force would be met with whatever resistance was necessary, and that the Hutchins family should consider their marriage over regardless of what the law technically said. The crisis that would finally resolve Clara's situation came about 6 months after Dan had rescued her from that fence, when Robert Hutchins and his father Cyrus appeared at Dan's ranch, demanding that Clara be returned to them immediately. Dan met them at the gate, blocking their entry to the property, and told them calmly that Clara had made clear she did not wish to return and that he was respecting her choice. Robert argued that Clara was his legal wife and had no right to refuse him, that Dan was interfering with his marriage, that the law would force Clara's return if he chose to pursue that remedy. Dan replied that Robert had forfeited any claim to Clara through his abuse, that whatever the law said on paper, no just person would force a woman back into a situation where she had been tortured and nearly killed. Cyrus, red-faced and angry, accused Dan of hiding behind his reputation and his guns, of being no better than a thief who had stolen another man's property. Dan's expression hardened at these words, and he told Cyrus and Robert that they had exactly 1 minute to leave his property before he would remove them by force, and that if they ever returned or if they made any further attempts to contact Clara, he would personally ensure they regretted it. The Hutchins men, seeing Dan's absolute seriousness and recognizing they were outmatched both in terms of physical force and community support, left with threats and curses, but left nonetheless. Clara had watched this confrontation from a window in the house, terrified that somehow she would be forced to return. But when she saw the Hutchins men ride away without her, she felt something break inside her, some last barrier of fear and tension, and she sat down and cried tears that were part relief and part release of months of held emotion. Dan came to check on her after the Hutchins men had gone, and he found Clara crying, and he sat down near her and told her gently that she was safe, that the confrontation was over, that he would not let them take her, that she could build her life here without fear. Clara looked at Dan through her tears and asked him why he continued to protect her, why he risked conflict with the Hutchins family for her sake, what he wanted from her in return. Dan told her truthfully that he wanted nothing except to know that she was safe and that justice had been done, that protecting her was not a burden but a choice he made freely, that she owed him nothing beyond what she chose to give. Something shifted between Dan and Clara in that moment, some recognition that they had become more than employer and employee, that their relationship had evolved into genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared values. Clara told Dan that he had saved her life not just once but continuously, that his kindness had begun to heal wounds she thought would never heal, that she felt gratitude beyond what words could express. Dan, uncomfortable with emotional displays but moved by Clara's words, simply told her that she had saved him too in ways she might not understand, that her presence had brought warmth and life back to his house and his existence, that he was glad she had come to his ranch. In the years that followed, Clara bloomed in the safety and security of Dan's ranch, gradually becoming the person she might have been if trauma had not shaped her early life. She took pride in her work and in creating a home that was warm and welcoming, and she began to develop interests and opinions beyond mere survival. Dan, for his part, found his initially solitary life enriched by Clara's presence, discovered that having someone to talk to and share meals with made existence more meaningful. Their relationship remained platonic and respectful, but it was also deeply caring, a partnership built not on romance but on mutual protection and genuine friendship. Clara never returned to the Hutchins family, and eventually obtained a legal divorce on grounds of abandonment and cruelty, though by that time, The marriage existed only on paper since her life had moved far beyond that dark chapter. In the harsh landscape of frontier Kansas, where cruelty could flourish unchecked, and where vulnerable people often suffered without recourse or rescue, the story of Dan Walker and Clara Mee stands as powerful testimony to the impact one person's courage can have when they refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. Dan Walker did not have to stop when he saw Clara tied to that fence, did not have to involve himself in what frontier culture considered private family business, did not have to risk conflict with the Hutchins family or take responsibility for a stranger's well-being. He could have ridden past, could have told himself that what happened between a man and his wife was not his concern, could have chosen the easier path of non-involvement that so many others had chosen. But Dan made a different choice in that moment, a choice that came from his own painful history and from an understanding that some things cannot be tolerated regardless of custom or convenience. Those 4 words he spoke, "She comes with me," were not just a declaration about Clara's immediate rescue, but a statement about human dignity and about the responsibility that comes with power. Dan had the strength and the reputation and the resources to intervene, and therefore he had the moral obligation to do so, because power that is not used to protect the vulnerable is power wasted. Clara's story could have ended in death or permanent brokenness, another forgotten victim of frontier brutality, her suffering unmarked and unmourned. Instead, because one person chose courage over convenience, Clara was given the chance to heal and to build a life defined by her own choices rather than by others' cruelty. Her transformation from a woman literally tied to a fence and left to die into a person who reclaimed agency and dignity demonstrates the resilience of the human spirit when given even minimal support and safety. The wild frontier was indeed a hard place that tested everyone who lived there, but it was also a place where individual actions mattered enormously, where one person's decision to intervene could literally mean the difference between life and death. Dan and Clara's story reminds us that we have responsibility toward each other that transcends law and custom, that witnessing suffering obligates us to act if we have the power to help, that standing against cruelty is not optional for those who claim to be decent human beings. Their legacy lives on in the enduring truth that heroism is not about grand gestures, but about choosing in critical moments to do what is right regardless of cost, that protecting the vulnerable is not weakness but the highest form of strength, and that sometimes the most powerful thing anyone can say is simply that another person's suffering will not be tolerated, that they will be defended, that they matter, that she comes with me, or he comes with me, because human dignity is not negotiable, and because we are all responsible for each other in ways that law cannot mandate but conscience demands.